Well, I don't know if any of you noticed a few weeks back, but there was an op-ed in the New York Times, which actually, I'm going to very, very loosely paraphrase, basically said, it's really not right to run around calling people climate deniers when they're simply asking reasonable questions as to why we should expend incredible amounts of money and base public policy on something that's based on modeling and whether or not these models are correctly interpreting what is going on, not just in the universe, but more specifically in our planet and in its atmosphere. And of course, the hailstorm that came back, the digital hailstorm of people screaming and shouting, canceling their subscriptions to the New York Times because someone would even dare say, maybe you need to listen to these people a bit. And of course, the charge of climate denier came back. And I realized at that point that this has actually become almost a matter of religious belief. So we need to go back and pick up some loose threads here, notably the charge about being a climate change denier and how, as Dr. Tim Ball said, basically we're winning the scientific arguments in terms of climate skepticism, but we are losing the strategic arguments, meaning in the media. And there was a wonderful article written about this that came out in National Review. Climate change activists are the real science denier, written by Orrin Cass, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he focuses on energy, the environment, and anti-poverty policy, and was domestic policy director of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign back in 2011-2012. The concept of climate denier, Orrin, meant to tie in the minds of people anyone who would question the modeling and the predictions being made and whether or not the universe is actually responding the way they're predicting in terms of climate or the planet, with somebody who denies, say, for example, that the Holocaust ever happened. From that point on, it simply became a useful epithet to throw at anybody who would challenge it. You never got an answer. I mean, for 20 years I've been asking reasonable questions, Orrin. I can't get answers back. I just get epithets.
Oh, yeah. I think it's a very strange direction the debate has gone because it's so important, and this is why I tried to do in my article, to separate between the places where we really do have a scientific consensus and pretty clearly established science, and where either the scientists are still trying to figure stuff out, or even more so where it's not a scientific question at all, it's a political and policy question. And so back in the day, I think this idea of deniers popped up to try to describe people who were saying there is no change in the climate or humans have nothing to do with changes in the climate. And on that grounds, we have awfully good evidence at this point that scientists know what's going on, and in fact, humans are affecting the climate. But the debate just shifted from there. We said, well, okay, but then do we know exactly what's going to happen in the future, what the consequences are going to be? And if you said that there's uncertainty there, people got frustrated and said, well, we'll call that person a denier too. Or if you even said, well, I understand the consequences, but I'm not sure wind and solar are going to be able to solve our problem, now you have people saying, well, then you're a denier too. And it's just become a matter of thinking you can win the argument by shouting denier instead of, in some cases, even understanding what the argument is about, let alone being able to put forward a rational argument.
Yeah, and as Bjorn Lomborg has pointed out, if we just even stipulate that mankind's activities are causing the bulk of global warming, let's just stipulate it. He said, can we do anything about it without totally wrecking the global economy? And his answer was a resounding no. Just even to affect it even slightly, we would have to make radical changes, which would affect especially poor populations and countries. And he said, you're better off preparing to live with it rather than trying to block it. But even those ideas get shouted down.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, I think the work that he has done is really important in highlighting that question and then also focusing on one side of it, which is what would it take to do anything about it? Is it even possible to do anything about it? And then the other side of that equation is really important too, which is, but how bad is it actually going to be? If you take all of the scientific projections and say, okay, let's say we could see warming of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century, that's very significant climate change. A lot of scientists consider that to be way out the end of the danger zone, so to speak. But if you look at the actual forecasts for what that means, it amounts to incredibly small economic costs. It amounts to only a couple of feet of sea level rise. And so those are real costs. Those are things that we're going to have to deal with as policymakers. But they don't suggest that we need to set our hair on fire or embark on a government-led transformation of the economy. They may just suggest this is among the many challenges we're going to have to think about and deal with this century.
The hysteria then, whence hath it come?
Well, There are a lot of theories about it. Some of them, I think, assume a lot of bad faith and say, well, this is, either it's a conspiracy or it's all people who are focused on wanting the government to take things over. I don't think that that's necessarily right. What I suspect is going on is that you have what are called cognitive distortions. And this is actually something that the hysterical folks came up with first. They said, look, if you're not panicked about climate change, it must be because either you don't realize how much you should care about the future, or because this is moving so slowly you don't realize what a crisis it is. And in a sense, they're right. I think they've pointed out some places where people are looking at this differently, but I think they're the ones who are looking at it wrong. So if you take the idea of costs out in the distance and you say, gosh, how should we think about these huge costs we might face in the year 2100? People who are really worried about this forget how different the year 2100 will be. They essentially take those costs and imagine them just showing up tomorrow. If you think about economic forecasts that far out into the future, the world will be probably 6 or 7 times wealthier than it is now. And that's not just abstract dollars. That means better technology. It means more resilient infrastructure. It means better public health. It means better food and water systems. And so when you imagine these impacts happening in that context, they're not nearly as scary anymore. And so it's important to realize there's a reason we don't worry so much about impacts in the distant future, because the distant future makes them less concerning. So I think there are a lot of things that go on that make climate change feel like humans are changing the climate. Surely that must be catastrophic. When if you actually dig down into it, you start to say, well, where exactly is the catastrophe here? And it doesn't usually show up.
What about the charge that 97% of scientists believe? This figure gets slung around a lot, and it's simplified compared to what the actual survey questions were.
Yeah, that's right. The original 97% consensus study essentially just looked at lots of climate research and said how much of it either explicitly states or seems to assume that the climate is changing and that humans play a role in it. And they found that about 97% of the papers came out on that side, as opposed to on the side that either the climate was not changing or we didn't know if humans played a role. And so I think that's important for people to understand that in the scientific community, there really isn't much dispute at this point that things are getting warmer, and there really isn't any dispute that humans emitting greenhouse gases are a factor in that. But what gets tacked on to that then is, you listen to a Bernie Sanders or a Barack Obama, they'll say not just that there's a consensus that climate change is happening and that humans contribute to it, but also that it's entirely because of humans and that it's going to be dangerous and that it's going to be catastrophic. Bernie Sanders will say all the scientists are telling us we have to transform our energy systems. None of that is true. Maybe some of those things are true, but it is not true that there is a consensus about those things. And so over-expanding the consensus, saying that we're certain about things that we're not certain about, I think it's really counterproductive. I think it leads to a debate where you're trying to win the debate by saying we're not allowed to have a debate instead of winning the debate in these areas where there actually is a lot to debate.
It's interesting you say that, because I've been saying for a long time, if we go back to former Vice President Al Gore, he was saying the debate is over, the debate is closed, and I kept repeating we never had the debate. I don't recall a robust debate in this area. Back to 1992, once the United Nations discovered this was their little cash cow that they could unite the world under, wham, all of the funding went in that direction. Dissenting scientists were defunded. So these outcomes are skewed. And in the long run, I actually see this as dangerous for science itself, that it's being so badly skewed by the politicals and the other debates.
Well, again, I think you have to distinguish which part of the science you're talking about. If you're talking about the science of, is there in fact warming going on? Back in the day, there was a debate about that, and a lot of work was done on it, and we've measured it from a lot of different ways. And yeah, people are still debating which measurement is best, exactly how much is it changing, where is it changing. But the idea that we are seeing a warming of the climate, I think it would be correct to say there isn't really any debate about that at this point. And similarly, to say that humans play a role, and in fact a significant role, is also pretty well established. We have very good scientific evidence from not just models, but from lab studies. We know that when you add certain greenhouse gases to an atmosphere, it's going to absorb more heat. And we know that we humans are adding a lot of those greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So we shouldn't be surprised that we have an effect on the climate as a result. But where Al Gore is hoping to close off the debate, and where certainly a lot of people are very intentionally trying to close off the debate, is then in the department of the so what. And that's what really matters. On any policy issue you can think about, there's some basic science that we all work from. We don't fight much about the science, but the science doesn't tell you what the right policy is. The science doesn't tell you how it's going to play out in our society, what the economic effects are going to be. It doesn't tell you which policies are cost effective. It doesn't tell you which policies we think the government can actually implement well. And that's a debate that's very important to have, and that a lot of folks who think they have the answer and who think the answer is government has to force certain types of expensive energy on the world, they're hoping to say there's not going to be any debate about that either. And that's where they're wrong. And I think they're going that direction because they realize that whenever that debate does happen, their side doesn't come out very well.
Just maybe why they didn't want to have it.
The cover your ears strategy is rarely the one you use when you have the best argument on the merits.
Yeah, argument weak, speak louder, use many words, use a stick if necessary. So,
yeah.
But that's following a lot of trend. If we look at academia, let's zoom out and go over to colleges where a lot of this is held, where people who are saying things that the consensus avoids, they won't allow them to speak on campuses. They shout them down. They block their ability to speak. This is not healthy for a free society.
Well, that's right. And I think it's an interesting connection to draw where you're not talking about scientific truths that everybody has already agreed on and you just have a few conspiracy theorists saying the other side of. You're talking about really important contested social and policy issues that's important for people to understand and that's important for us to hash out in public. If you take those kinds of issues and say we don't want to have that debate, anybody who takes this or that side of it is out of bounds. At the end of the day, you're probably weakening your own position and you're certainly harming the broader process of debate. And so I think it's important to push back on that, not by calling names from the other side, but by pointing out what's going on. And also distinguishing between these different kinds of arguments. And that's why one thing that I always try to do is not just say, look, the science isn't settled and anybody who says there's a scientific consensus is wrong. I don't think that's right. I think it's important that we acknowledge a scientific consensus where there is one, and then insist that everybody also be very disciplined about defining where that consensus ends and drawing the line between here's where we actually have a consensus that we should all start from. And on the other hand, here's where it's actually up for us to decide what we think, and everyone has the opportunity to put their case forward and we have to decide it on the merits.
Yeah, which is the way it should be. That's all I've ever said is we need this robust debate and may the winner be the best policy out there, and then we'll follow that one. So that's been the biggest problem that I have, is that we don't allow these debates. Having said that, Oren, are we going to get to the point where we do that now? Because it seems like the sides are pretty polarized, and you ever stick your hand in the middle of a cat fight, it's not a fun experience.
I believe my professional description is to stick my hand in cat fights.
I've done it physically, and I had to get on antibiotics because I did.
Well, I mean, look, I recently wrote a long essay for Foreign Affairs that talked about this idea that even assuming that all the science is correct, you can't go from there to just say, and therefore it's going to be a catastrophe. You have to look carefully at how well we're going to be able to cope with it. Michael Mann, who's a very prominent scientist on these climate issues, very outspoken, immediately took to Twitter to call the essay #Coke Climate Denial Propaganda. Look, if there's anything inaccurate in my essay, please point it out. But don't just shout names at it, especially when no part of the accusation is true or even makes very much sense. But I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in the debate because the folks who are trying to use the name-calling, shutting down of debate, they're having to get ever more aggressive and attack an ever larger share of the population. And so you're starting to see some pretty reasonable folks who take the science very seriously and are working very hard on policy solutions. Now they're being told that they're deniers too. And their reaction to that is, whoa. When we thought you were just calling the crazy people deniers, we let that slide. But if you start calling everybody a denier, it's not going to work very well. You're going to have an awfully large group of pretty reasonable people who respond unkindly to it. And so I think we're starting to see that the people who have just this absolutist mindset of we know exactly what's going on, we know the kind of catastrophe this is, and we know what we have to do, it's pretty evident to everybody that they can't actually defend that position. And as more and more people point that out, more and more people are getting called names as a response, and that's not going to last. I think we're going to see more and more reasonable people in the middle of this debate who aren't at the one extreme of saying this is all a conspiracy and a hoax, and they're not at the other extreme of saying we already know all the answers and the rest of you are deniers, but who are willing to say, look, we understand what is settled and what is still in need of debate, and we want to be reasonable about hashing it out. And I think we're moving back in that direction, but you have to get enough hands into the cat fight to pull the cats apart.
Wear gloves, preferably ones with chainmail or Kevlar. Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, that doesn't tend to be an option in the policy debates. You stick your hand in there and you make sure you have the metaphor breaks down here, but if your hand has a good enough argument, the cats aren't going to hurt it.
And you have to be able to tolerate that. As I always say, if you're not enjoying being in the fight, then you really need to go do something different. Same as martial arts. If you don't enjoy doing this, go do something else. All right.